Okay, I am going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Trump is going to lead a protectionist and isolationist government that significantly harms the amount of international trade and breaks off existing relations and trade deals. This is true for a couple of reasons. A, because he's already promised it. He's promised to leave NATO, to stop funding the Ukraine, and he is extremely skeptical of trade deals. In his previous administration, he broke off the NTTP, or whatever that transatlantic, trans-Pacific thing is called, and all those kinds of stuff. Secondly, because his voters care deeply about this. They're rural, they produce locally, they want the jobs to come back to America and to manufacture in America. Historically, he comes from a more protectionist part of the Republican Party, and if you look at the elites who are supporting him, his new VP, Vance, strongly supports worker rights and bringing back jobs, and so he'll be pushing that. And finally, I also think he's just friends with, he doesn't see a problem with a lot of the stuff that's happening in the world. He doesn't care if Putin takes over the Ukraine. He doesn't think it's his problem or particularly matter, and he says he respects Putin and respects Kim Jong-un. So we just think that he's not particularly motivated to actually address these kinds of issues because doesn't see them as a problem. On the comparative, I think that Harris has already promised to stay and support. I think that they feel that international trade, she feels that international trade is important, and the voters actually care about this stuff because oftentimes they provide services that are only worked through international trade, and because she believes in international trade and believes in the values of democracy and wants to spread them throughout the world. We're going to win this debate in one very clear way. I want to weigh this ahead of time. We're going to explain why trade is the most important thing. A few reasons for this. One, because when China starts trading with these countries in Latin America, countries all around the world that it wouldn't be able to today because America crowds it out, this provides it far more leverage than it had on the comparative, meaning that it gets significantly better trade deals. Secondly, because I think that we are already seeing a change in the Chinese economy to one that is tech-based and one that is much more high-level export-focused. It doesn't need the American market in the same way that it did in the past in order to sell it the very low-level goods. Instead, it now sells finished products and high-level goods, like through Huawei, through its electric car companies, etc. And I think that those are the places where it doesn't need the American market as much. We think that the trade war that probably governments want to talk about had an effect in the past, and then China learned the lesson and invested a huge amount in creating the internal abilities to overcome this trade war so that it no longer harms them to a significant extent, right? When they were cut off from Android, that initially significantly hurt Huawei. But Huawei sales have come back to what they once were through the internal development that they had to do. Their chip manufacturing is world-class now through the fact that they've had to do this internally. Fourthly, no thank you, I think that the countries they're going to deal with care significantly less about sanctions and limitations and other kinds of regulations, which means they can sell them different kinds of things and they can sell them in a more abusive manner and earn more money off them. And fourthly, I think it empowers just them. When they make trade deals with the US also benefits. If they make trade deals with countries who no longer trade with the US, this significantly empowers them versus the US. And fifthly, I think this is a far longer term effect than anything else that we talked about in the debate. Even if I afterwards give reasons why Trump might hurt the US by hurting the bureaucracy or hurting things like this, after 4 years when Trump leaves office, most people understand that that's going to be the case, and so they won't leave the bureaucracy, or the harms to the American economy aren't that long term, but the specificity of long-term trade deals, the fact that you create these kinds of relationships and lose the connections with other countries is far more long-term and far more certain. Great. After weighing that, now let's prove it. Why do we think this significantly pushes the countries to China, making them have far more trade? I think I have 5 reasons for this. 1, I think that Trump is very likely to significantly cut FDI and aid. I think that we see this, A, because of his, as I already mentioned, his campaign promises, but B, because investing significantly in America and in American manufacturing and bringing back trade that America has lost abroad involves coming at the expense of other kinds of FDI. On the comparison, I think that Harris doesn't want to do that, wants to remain in the existing trade deals, wants to remain in the existing stuff and sell the kinds of services like software services, like Amazon Cloud and things like this, which are new markets and which don't involve cutting the aid that it already provides. I also think that we hear that Trump wants to cut aid, for example, to the Ukraine. This obviously also has an external impact of significantly strengthening China's largest ally, the Russia. And if Russia wins the Ukraine war because Trump stops supporting it, then obviously that's also going to be a significant benefit for the US. Cool. Secondly, I also think that Trump seems very unstable, right? He is very nasty and horrible and doesn't talk in the same language, but also he's just constantly doing these weird things. Like suddenly he'll say, I want to cut these things, I'm going to go into this trade war. You cannot trust him to actually do the things that he's promising his allies, which means that his allies don't see that much value in being allies with him. He might promise to have a trade deal with you today, but tomorrow he'll decide he doesn't actually want that trade deal, and so he's going to pull out, and he doesn't respect historical American trade deals. Yes.
What is the biggest consumer market for EVs in the world?
I think that if you aggregate the US, if you aggregate Europe and Asia, then probably they're bigger than the US. Cool. I think that whereas in the comparative, I think that it is much easier, both for Europe, but also for other countries in Latin America, for example, to collaborate with Harris because she understands them and cares about them. But also notice about Latin America. I think that Donald Trump hates Latin America. He hates the immigration. He talks about them horribly. He talks about cutting off the aid and the trade deals with them. He talks about repatriating immigrants. He talks about taking away their remittance. And I think that all of these things cause significant harm to Latin America, both in their ability to actually sell to the US, but also B, in the fact that this will come into large economic expense to them. This is exactly what pushes them far more to China, into making trade deals with China, and allows China military access to their area, like building ports in Argentina, docking their destroyers there, etc., which obviously China is good for China. I think that on a comparative, Harris reaches out to support them far more. But fourthly, I think that because Trump needs to sell goods internally, this means that that other countries abroad lose a ton of jobs. So Vietnam, ASEAN, and all these countries that would have produced and sold to the US now need to sell to a different market. China is the second largest market in the world. Obviously, that's going to be the first person that they would turn to, especially since they have a much closer relationship to China than they do to Europe oftentimes, which means that this comes at the expense of that this significantly empowers China, especially because now there is no longer a competing interest where they could before play off China and the US in order to get better deals. So now China gets the best deal. Finally, I also think that this just burns international bridges, which means that it is more difficult for the US in the future, because the next time they vote in somebody like Trump, he's just going to burn up every trade deal that we wrote. What are the impacts of this? One, economically. I think that China gets to sign far more trade deals with far more of the world, selling the goods that it wants to sell most. Secondly, it creates more economic advancement for China. And thirdly, it provides more basic goods at cheaper things. This looks like cheaper food, but it also looks like cheaper minerals in order to produce their higher end products. Secondly, diplomatically, this means more UN votes, more access to military things like the South China Sea, and less chance that the US actually reacts. Thank you so much.
Order.
Let's chat about what Trump is like as an actor. There are three things I want to frame here. The first is that he's very hard on China. He beats them over the head and uses it as a stick to try to get votes. There are three broad reasons for this. The first is his strongman image that he wants to project, which is diametrically opposed to that of an autocratic state, which has a large market and a large military. The second reason is that they're just an easy target because a lot of his voters in places like the Midwest have lost their manufacturing jobs to China, which is a manufacturing powerhouse. As a result, you're able to get that sort of support. Thirdly, because it's to justify things like the COVID response, which was blamed on him by Democrats, and as a result, there's an incentive to try to push it off into China and say they're a bad. This is empirically true. I don't think this will be contested. Second thing to say, though, is that he's unpredictable, as is mentioned by opening government. He's temperamental, he's senile, he's not very well informed, he's not a politician. The third thing to say, though, is that he's very powerful, and he doesn't have many checks and balances on him, for a couple of reasons. The first is that there's a direct flow of information out of his mouth, which then becomes policy. Previously it was his Twitter account, now he uses other forms of communication to reach out to the public. As a result, when he promises something, there's a substantial push within his party to bring this into effect. We would notice this looked like the US embassy being moved, in Israel being moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on a whim, as he put it out in a tweet. The second thing to say is he picks loyalists, like Vance. He wants to bring in different people into the civil service through Project 2025 to get people who are loyal to him by removing civil servants who will not follow by his every word, modifying their contracts to try to do try to do things that he wants. As a result, then, we think that he can act on the incentives that he's previously given. To that end, three arguments. One, his unpredictability harms the CCP. Notice, the CCP is not in a democratic state. As a result, they must base their legitimacy on their success. They use long-term plans as opposed to short-term plans in order to gain this legitimacy. In terms of capacity, the reason why they do this is because there's no election cycles. As a result, they can continue to push plans like the BRI, which will work by 2050, or other development plans that will work into like 2070. The second reason for why they would do this is because it allows them to shirk accountability in the short term. They're able to say, yes, we're having wages falling, we're having people having to migrate, but it's okay because it's going to come good in the long run, and we were able to show this because of previous track record. The third thing to say is just that often projects can be built better if they're over a longer period of time. No, thank you. Like the PRI, which takes a lot of different countries getting on board, which takes infrastructure projects which might last 10, 20 years. We think that the US are integral to many of these plans because they're interconnected in many ways. The first thing to say is economically, China and the US are massively interconnected. They have giant consumer bases in both countries. US MNCs like Apple work within China and have their largest factories there. As a result, then, you need to rely on the US to a substantially great degree for your economy to continue to function. You have similar industries in places like manufacturing. In order for things like EVs to be manufactured in China, you need raw materials which are sometimes produced in the United States. The second thing to say is that they fight in similar quarters, which is to say that they're looking for similar markets like India, like Bangladesh. As a result, you'll have situations where there's a Chinese supplier and a US producer which have a symbiotic relationship. The implication of this is that because Trump is unpredictable and constantly changing the US's plans, you can never be sure whether your whole economy is going to get fucked over and your long-term plans which you're reliant on for your legitimacy are going to get fucked over. We think this means that even if we don't prove that Trump is bad for China in the way he acts, you have a consistent risk that he could do something which stops everything that you based your legitimacy on. There's a very low burden argument in order to work. Second argument, he will go hard on the CCP and cause them economic strife. Notice, we've already given the incentives and capacity inside of the frame, no thank you, as to why he has the incentive to go hard on China and the capacity to do whatever he wants. We would say that this is really bad when he puts things like tariffs, protections and stuff like this on TikTok, on Huawei, on EVs, for a couple of reasons. The first thing to say is just trivially, it makes it less desirable to buy these goods within the largest and wealthiest consumer market in the world, which is the United States' consumer market. We think that electronic vehicles, no thank you, are not being bought by families in rural India, they're being bought by wealthy Americans. As a result, when you lock people out of buying these Chinese goods, you massively harm them. The second thing to say, though, is there's a signaling effect whereby others that are within the US's sphere of influence also don't buy these products, like the EU, like Korea. We've noticed there are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, historical relations. They care about the US and they want to keep up the interactions they've had through like favorable trade deals, through being at each other's backs through times of economic crisis. The US and their large banks often bailed out these countries during the 2008 financial crisis. The second thing to say is that the trust, the way that systems have been set up in these countries often relies on US technology as opposed to Chinese technology. For example, Korea have US software which is necessary for their military to function. The renewable energy which is being generated in Finland is also reliant on US technology which is not compatible with Chinese technology. It means that there will be a long period of time in order to shift and move towards the Chinese alternatives, which is a massive sunk cost for these nations. As a result, when the US leads the way, these other nations follow. Harris is not going to be bad on this for a couple of reasons, which I think OG kind of hints at themselves. The fact, or I don't even hint, actually, to be fair, they met them, which is that, like, I'll just give them more in case back half wants to try to say something about this, which is the rhetoric of Harris is directly towards being open towards China. They have different voters within the US voter base. No, thank you. No, thank you. I mean, yes, she visited like Taiwan, but broadly, she's also had like interactions with like trade deals and stuff like this. But also, additionally to this, we note there are different voters within the Democratic Party as opposed to the Conservative Party. So, or not the Conservative, yeah, the Republican Party. But within the Democrats, there are wealthy Democrats who need the sorts of technologies being produced by China and want to have this. As a result, you have a voter incentive to give this to them. We'd also note that the Democrats want to be conservative in terms of their financial policy once they get into office. The reason for this is they have incumbency and they're going on being a stability candidate. That's how Joe Biden was marketed. That is how Harris is marketed in the status quo. As a result, you don't want to start things like trade wars which make you look crazy and radical. For the third extension, closing.
Assuming you're right, and China has 60-year-old plans that somewhat rely on the US. At worst, what the US can do is make those 62-year-old plans. Who cares? It's a tiny delta.
62-year-old? No, that's silly. It's like all of your plans into the future which operate for the next 20, 30 years of your economy. That's a silly POI. Third argument. Countries pivot harder towards the US due to their protectionism. Notice, the US has advantages that exist over China in the status quo. Four I want to mention. One, institutional knowledge, like their Silicon Valley, which produces very good technology. Secondly, control of institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and ICC, which other countries have to rely on. Three, assistance in other ways, like their large military, which can bail out countries in times of conflict. Fourthly, they have a wealthier market than China. As a result, many countries will continue to want to interact with China, regardless of whether Trump is isolationist or not. What happens then is you need to be friendlier to the US, which comes at things like having exclusivity deals with them, which means you cannot trade with China. It means agreeing that you're going to have your military only function by the US. You're going to have your energy grid only serviced by the US as opposed to China. Given that I've proven you want to keep acting with the US, given that I've proven that Trump will settle for nothing less, we've proven that at least a swath of countries that exist in places like Southeast Asia will continue to stay close to the US and will not go and pivot towards China on their side of the house, which is a massive loss to the CCP into the long run. You introduce risk, You lock out large amounts of your market, and you also stop the CCP from being able to hold them legitimacy into the future for these reasons, opening opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to the case up in the government. Here.
I'm going to show what Leader of Opposition lacked. The answer is mostly two things. One, any engagement with our case, but two, a counterfactual to the entirety of their case. Secondly, I'm going to weigh why US isolationism is the biggest impact in this debate and the most important interest of the CCP, even if they were to get their impacts on trade war. But before that, let's do some refutations. I want to observe that like 6 minutes of this LO speech were about why Trump will be leading trade war on China. I agree, I concede. There was 1 minute on why Harris would not do the same, which is based on a factual lie, which is she said she will renew trade with China. She did not say that. And we did not concede this. We conceded that Harris is better on international trade, not with China specifically. Here are a few reasons to believe that trade war with China is roughly symmetric. One, the Biden administration, with Kamala Harris as vice president, didn't only inherit the trade war from Trump without taking it down, but actually added further sanctions. Biden tried to take down TikTok. Biden put specifically heavy sanctions on EVs and also pressured the EU to place similar sanctions, which is why both the US and the EU are now putting 100% tariffs on import of Chinese cars. Secondly, we think that the voters that Kamala Harris is competing for are the same voters with the same interest that the Leader of Opposition describes. Why? Because currently both Trump and Harris compete on swing votes in the US, which are disproportionately full of laborers who are impacted by jobs lost to Chinese imports, which is exactly why also Harris has an incentive to go harsh on China. Thirdly, because we think that specifically because Harris is less isolationist and has more interest in international diplomatic relations, like LO concedes for us, is yet another reason why she does not want China to grow stronger and why she would want to continue these trade sanctions. Why? One, because she knows that if they continue trading with China on technology, this would lead to more intellectual property theft by China that could then be used for their own military needs. But secondly, because she has many allies who are actively fearing China. This includes Taiwan, as was conceded by LO. This includes Japan. This includes the Philippines. This includes Vietnam. This means that because of her loyalty to her allies that they concede Trump won't have, she will also want to go hard on China. No comparative there. Secondly, we think that even if there was a comparative there, China has already adjusted. This case was relevant when the trade war started back in 2016. At this point, Tsinghua is the leading university in the world in research of applied sciences. China is the biggest exporters of photovoltaic cells. China is leading on technological progress in the world. It has adjusted. It does no longer rely on US imports for that. Lastly, we also think that even without sanctions, and even if we were to believe that Harris would have lifted all sanctions, which is ridiculous, American companies will not go back to China anyway. And no, they are lying to you that they have their infrastructure there. You know when they took it out, independent of sanctions, when after zero COVID policy and after the economic crisis, the CCP cranked down on the financial sector, on the real estate sector, and had massive interventions, which was when the American companies also realized, regardless of sanctions, China is an unreliable partner to trade with, which is when they moved most of their infrastructure to Vietnam, which was easy because it shares a border on the exact same industrial area in China, so it was not very difficult for them to do. So no, we don't think they have a delta there. Let's continue then. Regarding EVs, one, I think the biggest market for this is actually Europe, and I think since the US is going to probably sanction them anyway, it is better that the US is in worse relations with Europe after Trump leaves NATO and so on, and stops backing Ukraine, so that Europe is not as pressured by the US to also impose sanctions on EVs. Okay, cool. Let's weigh our case. What are our impacts? Why do we think they win the debate? Firstly, I wanted to observe this is the most long-run impact in the debate, the isolationism. Why? Because both Trump and Harris are limited in their capacity. Trump can only be a president for 4 more years. Harris can be a president for up to 8 years. Whichever policies they pass will pass eventually, and a new president might overturn them. However, the isolationism Trump inflicts uniquely is going to stay in the long run, long after he leaves office. Why? Because even if a new US president wants to maintain new relationships, it would be too late for two reasons. One, China would have already had the opportunity to enter these new untapped markets and create relations with them, like it is already doing with Argentina, like it is already doing with Iran, and so on. And secondly, because it also means that global powers know that they cannot trust the US enough to rely on it. It is not enough to have a new president that now says, now we do want to be in good relations with you. Because in order for countries to be willing to be reliant on the US, maintain these relations at a personal cost, such as not developing their own militaries because they rely on NATO and so on, they need to trust that the US won't bail on them when a new president is elected. When they realize, due to Trump, that the American loyalship is partisan and not a bipartisan issue, this is an irreversible benefit to China. Closing.
Yeah, look, you're just lying that Trump is going to embargo South America. The countries are very closely and politically aligned. I just don't think that's going to happen.
Few things on this. One, Trump really hates South America, continuously says how they are responsible for migrants coming to the US, and continuously attacks the Latin American leaders. Secondly, as OO concedes, Trump is generally extremely protectionist, and most jobs in the US are actually lost to Latin America because this is where they have the closest import, where they have the most migrants from, so he's very likely to tackle this. Lastly, even if you don't buy Latin America, you have the Middle East, you have Africa, you have Europe, you have so many places Trump is pulling out of. Next, Wayne. We think that our impact is also obviously more unique in this debate because policy-wise, Harris and Trump don't differ a lot, as I said, on China. They differ much more on other countries. Thirdly, we think that our impact also allows more pressure on the US in the future. Whatever it is China wants from the US, say that it wants more trade, it will be better able to do it if it has more influence, say on the Philippines, preventing the US from having easy access to the South China Sea and threaten them, if it has more access to Latin America and being on their border. Lastly, we think whether the CCP cares more about econ or imperialism, both are impacted by American diplomacy, whereas any other case only impacts one. Proposed.
Not in the abstract. Because Hadar said their impact is long run and their impact is unique, and therefore we should value it for these reasons. First thing I would note is predictability is also long run, in the sense that if Trump is an incredibly irrational actor due to the fact he is much older, has much less cognitive capacity, in fact he has a whole stranglehold of his party and can do whatever the fuck he wants in terms of policy and change his mind constantly. In fact, he is very ill-informed and an arrogant celebrity who does whatever he wants all the time, would all indicate that because he can change policy at the drop of a hat when elected, and because he can do things without relatively little accountability, the ability he has to fuck up CCP long-term plan is actually huge in the long run. The CCP plans on a 20-30 year timescale based on their predictions of other countries' behavior and what's likely to happen, and based on their prediction of what's happening in current global affairs. The issue then, if the leader of the United States is an unpredictable madman, is that it is very difficult to predict what he's going to do, and the massive risk associated with this is when he inevitably changes his mind on something, no thank you, radically changes his policy, or radically changes the US's stance on something. The ability to react is quite difficult when you've made a long-term plan based off a promise he made in an election that he decides he no longer wants to keep. But secondly, obviously this is also unique. That's what happens in the trade-off debates panel. We're talking about Donald Trump versus Harris. We're all running unique impact as to why one thing happens on one side and doesn't happen on another. What an uncomparative weighing mechanism. But thirdly, I would say what's very crucial is this is a pretty severe and irreversible impact for the CCP. Because the problem with fucking up their plans in the medium to long term is, firstly, having to pivot means that they are often disadvantaged because they've detrimentally relied on these things. Secondly, it costs fucking money to change your policies, or where you're investing, or where you're trading, and who you're working with. All those things are incredibly expensive. And thirdly, I think that because it is irreversible, it screws with their ability to get the impact they've been going for. Like the fact if you're assuming the BRI is going to work out, or you massively invest in soft power in countries that the US is allegedly pulling out of and opening governments, and then Trump decides to change his mind 2 years in because he decides he really likes Iran for some fucking reason. All of that fucks up your ability to actually exercise soft-power in those areas. But finally, I would say it is critical for the CCP that they are viewed as legitimate, and that legitimacy is inherently tied to their ability to pay off their plans in the long run. The fact that they can trade off short-term harms to people, and they can say that things are going to get better, as long as their plans always seem to work out the way that that they intend to. What that leads to otherwise is massive risk of people being dissatisfied and massive risk that you are not having control of the populace that you say you do. All of that threatens their legitimacy and the ability of people to buy into the CCP and what they are putting down, which means that the risk of people protesting or getting angry at the CCP increases if you are consistently unable to live up to the policy promises you have made. I know that is more weighing metrics than opening government. We like numbers and debating a bit entirely, but also I think we've justified why this is unique to the motion and massively empirically important to the CCP. Let's engage then with the responses that Hadar gives. The first thing she says is that we have only 1 minute of comparative on Harris and 6 minutes on why Trump is likely to do a trade war. Panel, I would note, I think you're smart enough to say that if Andy says Trump is unpredictable, you can probably infer that he means that Harris is not. Do we need to insert the word comparatively into every sentence, or are you able to track the debate? I trust the second. Opening government does it. But the other things I would say is, firstly, Harris is obviously more predictable because the end impact of all of Andy's mechanisms, that Trump is old, that he has a stranglehold on his party, are things that are not true of Harris, the new Democratic candidate who's only just been selected as the presidential candidate. Secondly, she is less protectionist, but that means she will engage with other nations. But this is a good thing for China, right? Firstly, because when the US massively engages in other countries the way they do now, China can accuse them of being interventionist and use that as a justification to be interventionist themselves in ways they are likely to want to do on both sides of the debate. But secondly, because it drives the US's enemies into Xi Jinping's loving arms. Do you think Russia's not pretty fucking dependent on China at the point where the US is fucking them up in the Ukraine war or fucking them up in other senses? They are not as dependent if the US, no thank you, no longer has that capacity. Which means if the US is engaging in these ways and it hurts the US's enemies, that drives them towards China, increasing the reliance on China. This is obviously in China's interest. But thirdly, the obvious difference, even if you buy there's exactly the same likelihood of trade wars being done exactly the same way for some fucking reason, is firstly, Kamala is just likely to engage with China very differently. Firstly, because she's a career politician and a lawyer, she was Attorney General of her state. She's much smarter and more reasonable than Trump. She has much more political background. She spent her whole career in it. He is a celebrity and an arrogant motherfucker. He is not thoughtful about the way he does these things. He's going to be flippant in how he deals with these matters. But secondly, she's beholden to her party in a way that Trump isn't. I would notice that J.D. Vance was anti-Trump the last time he ran for, the first time he ran for president, but now is pro-Trump because everyone in the Republican Party is now just fucking puppets and mouthpieces for Donald Trump. They already know that the difference between his 2016 Republicans manifesto and the 2024 one is that his name was mentioned 60 times in the latter and 0 times in the first. Yeah. The Republicans have become the party, wait 20 seconds, of Trump. Then the difference then is that they are entirely beholden to what he does, but he's an irrational actor. But that's not true of Democrats and Harris, who has to be consistent, has to present a plan that she sticks to, and has to prove that she's legitimate because she's somebody who's come in at the last minute and needs to prove that she is still relatively democratic. No, thank you. The third thing is that she yeah, okay, that's already done. I would note then, when they say that China is like doing pretty good and tariffs can't make things any worse, and I would note we've shown that Trump's trade war, if that happens, will be worse, but also likely far more intense because of the reputational and legacy harms that he has because of how he handled COVID and he wants to blame someone for it. Firstly, obviously all tariffs just can get worse. Like, the fact that China has got to pivot from the original tariffs doesn't mean they can't get worse, be imposed on more goods, be imposed more severely. Secondly, obviously when they concede China as an export economy, sanctions and tariffs do hurt them. And that's particularly true when the US economy is relatively integrated with the global economy right now. In 4 years, Trump cannot change how many... No, thank you. CG? Sure.
It may be difficult to predict which world leader Trump will offend, but Yishai did show why it is predictable that he will be isolationist, as that is his voting platform promises what he did in his past regime. You cannot just say he is unpredictable without engaging any of this.
Yeah, but the specifics are he has absolute control over Republican voters. There's like he has absolute control over his party. Also, Republican voters just buy into what he says, even though he does not follow through on many of his promises. He did not successfully build the wall with Mexico. He just started building one. He says a lot of populist rhetoric. He does not fulfill it, but his voters still buy whatever he's putting down. And obviously then, when he continues to be the madman screaming into the internet, he's still going to be the person who his voters vote for because they believe he is different than the establishment and because they believe that he is going to fulfill his promises, even though he never actually does. So I just don't think that proves that he's going to be protectionist. I just don't think you've proven that he's not going to be massively risky. Also, Andy weighs on, even if it is a risk, that risk is very harmful to their ability to plan, and that is fact. But the problem with tariffs, right, is that when supply chains for the US go through a number of different countries, when you have like the minerals taken from one place, and like a primary good is made in one place, and then it is produced into the final product in another country, and then it is sold in the US. They're able to tariff at every single point of that chain, anything that's gone through China, which means that the ability for anything coming from China to reach the US is often tariffed at many stages, discouraging any country that is the in-between from ever engaging in that trade in the first place, because they would have to pay the tariff themselves. And the problem is because they don't like to please the US, they do not want to turn to China to the same degree. For all those reasons,
start with opening opposition and everything that came out very weirdly and the implication that stemmed from their case alone before introducing even any substantive coming from CG. Firstly, if opening opposition want to run the idea that China is primarily based on a long-termist economy, they imply multiple things. One, they are not beholden to what the people think of short-termist implications, meaning at the point where they want to impact it by saying people will protest because you're not completing the things that you promised to complete. These things are things that might happen in 2060 by their own metric, right? Secondarily, unclear why protesting is a realistic risk within communist China. Thirdly, even if it was, unclear why they care if protests would happen. Then if opening opposition want to claim the idea that, oh, but US is integral to plans. I'm never given an explanation how the US is integral to the plans of the Chinese Communist Party. They just say they're important for the economy somehow. I am unclear to what extent this might be true. Even insofar as that you need to buy things from the US, or you need to deal with US companies, or even if by some miracle Chinese software is running Microsoft Windows, I don't see why this is such a huge problem. Because if the plans are made on a time scale of 60 years, delaying that time scale by 5 or 10 years isn't that big of an impact to China itself. But even so, China is not that reliant on the US to complete its long-term plans, as those plans have been dealing with other countries that they already have established agreements with. Countries within BRICS, countries within sub-Saharan Africa that they already have established deals with, and those are the countries that they rely on for these deals. Unclear why America is so important here, right? And even so, even if you buy none of this, Trump's current plan is he's saying he's going to be tough on China, right? Everybody in the debate is going to agree on this. If he is flippant about his plans and often unpredictable or unreliable, that means the inverse of this plan is not being tough on China. If the old claim then implicitly is Trump is going to flip around and not be tough on China, is bad for China, unclear why this is probably true. Now, the problem with what happened with the opening government is that it's somewhat unclear and lacking a bit of the mechanization why things are specifically in the interest of China, right? How specifically is Latin American ports and why are Latin American ports the most important thing for China? Why is the way that trading elsewhere is good enough, right? This is the hole that we're going to fill from closing government. Note, what's the biggest interest that China probably has? The biggest interest China has is Southeast Asia, specifically getting to the Malacca Strait, specifically having soft power or hard power over their closest neighboring countries, which is very important for them economically as they control a lot of the factories in nearby production, but also because they have the potential to control the islands of the sea that they rely on their aquatic export for, which is the vast majority of their export. This is a clear mechanization of why they care about Southeast Asia. What does this mean, and why is their influence over Southeast Asia more likely to strengthen at the point where Trump gets elected? One, regardless of what policy Trump pulls, because that is speculative on any side of the house, his rhetoric is inherently that he is going to do protectionism, and his rhetoric is inherently, that's regardless of HUJI's mechanisms, the rhetoric is inherently that he's going to put jobs back into the US. Note two things about that. What HUJI don't tell you is that the problem with that is Trump is keen to do protectionism poorly. What does this mean? Firstly, at the point where Trump has already done protectionism with things such as steel tariff imports, those were done extremely rashly because he is extremely dependent on the popular vote of the people that he believes elect him, right? He really cares about what Fox News says about him, right? Things like that means he is more likely to put policies quickly to differentiate himself from the shaky party. What does this do? At the point where he implements things quickly, he implements steel tariffs quickly. At the point where he has also done this in the past, this probably means that domestic steel supply cannot meet the domestic demand of American steel as has already happened in the past. It's likely to appear for other things. No. That meaning, at the point where domestic supply of the US cannot meet the domestic demand of the US, prices of steel go up, meaning Chinese steel or other export that China has go up in price as well, strengthening their own economic relations to the rest of the world that they are able to deal with. When HUJI just say, oh, but the conglomerate of every other trade that China has outside of the US is bigger than their sum of their trade with the US, they don't explain why it's likely that the amount of trade done elsewhere is going to be similar, and their impacts hinge on this benefit. but before that, Martha, please.
So it sounds like what you've recognized is that Trump does things erratically, fast, and that would affect foreign affairs, economy, and everything else, which would make predictability pretty difficult for the CCP.
It doesn't matter if predictability is extremely important for the CCP, because you have to show why CCP hinge on the idea that they can predict Trump's specific actions. Secondarily, I would like to challenge this idea that the GOP is entirely beholden to Trump because opening opposition just say, oh, but they are. And the examples, check your notes, the examples they give are the most arbitrary things you could possibly do. Oh no, moving the US embassy in Israel. Who cares where they move it? Why is it extremely important? Unclear from opening opposition why Trump has the ability to control the GOP over important policies that they do, right? Secondarily, note that because Trump was incapable of effectively running off his past term, there is now a Project 2025 that is being built by his own admission without his input. It is likely to go through. To that extent, there are people who know of Trump's incompetence and are actively planning around it. Therefore, it's unclear why Trump has such a hold over GOP, as it's likely that he might even lose this election, and with Kamala's polls running higher and higher, it's unclear why he still has this unshaking and unwavering loyalty. The only example they give is, oh, but Vance now swapped his sides, which obviously he did at the point where he vetted for being VP. Unclear why the rest of the party is also likely to do the same. What does this mean? This means that at the point where Trump's power projection ideals create a high enough risk for countries within Southeast Asia, at that point where he says, at that point, it's at the point where Trump's power projection is enough of a risk for countries within China, countries neighboring China, and his idea of protectionism is likely to harm the decoupling from China that Biden has already started, and the factories that exist there or the jobs that exist there. At that point, those countries have no alternatives other than moving closer to China, therefore increasing the soft power that China has over these countries, increasing the ability of China to control the Malacca Strait, increasing the ability of China to control the ideas, to control things, the sea around them, increasing the capability of China to do things such as island chaining, and therefore establish their political power globally.
Sorry, I'm going to. Did someone say Malacca? Okay, that's fine. Okay, sorry.
I don't need to be aligned.
Couple pieces of clarification that I want to make very, very obvious at the beginning of the speech. The first is that I think foreign policy and trade doesn't change that significantly between a Harris and Trump administration. The reason why is because the Republicans and Democrats have relatively symmetric incentives on both of these things. For example, both Harris and Trump want to privilege US workers in industry, which is why the Democrats did things like the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. They both do things like power projection in places like Southeast Asia because both Democrats and Republicans, and crucially their voter bases, are relatively anti-China because xenophobia is bipartisan in the US. As opening government says, things like trade wars and sanctions are likely to be symmetric, and even if Trump is unpredictable and you buy that characterization, many of these kinds of decisions are not necessarily only made by him. They are also made by GOP or Democratic Party strategists. The second thing is, even if foreign policy and trade does change a bit between the administrations, it is not as significant as the difference between the two parties on domestic policy and things like government spending, insofar as these are the kinds of things that are most tangible and understandable to voters, and so they are promises that both parties have to deliver the most on. Things like infrastructure spending and healthcare spending are crucially the promises that you need to follow through on, because that's what voters feel on an everyday level, whereas tariffs on some niche good aren't necessarily the things that people care about, and so people are less likely to meet their promises on that. Next piece of crucial clarification I want to make is, what is the gravest problem that the CCP is facing in the status quo? Like, what is the biggest interest of the CCP right now? The problem that they are facing is that they are fucking drowning in debt, and you should know this, but there are two reasons why that's the case. Firstly, it's because they've had downturn in economic growth. For example, the decrease in population growth means that they overestimated the amount of market demand they would have. So they did things like build hundreds of thousands of empty houses that are never going to be bought because they don't have enough fucking people to buy the houses, right? Which is why you get a recession. Secondly, they had relatively unaccountable state-owned enterprises that don't necessarily need to be profitable because, they're all owned by the state, so they can basically take on as much debt as they want. They don't need to be as fiscally responsible as a private entity. What happens when the debt gets worse and the debt financing costs go up? Firstly, it means that the CCP is crucially forced to cut back public spending domestically, which is the key to its political legitimacy. Because when you have to pay 10%, 20% more on your debt, which amounts to hundreds or tens of billions of dollars, that is when you aren't able to deliver goods that you promised the Chinese people. This is the most important factor for the CCP, and it's more important than foreign policy considerations because this is what determines the political stability and the legitimacy of the CCP within its own borders. I think foreign policy is just kind of instrumental to that, right? The reason why CCP wants to do certain foreign policy actions is because it placates the domestic population. If we prove impacts on the domestic population, that is the most direct impact in debate. But secondly, it also constrains your foreign policy. It means that you aren't able to do things like the BRI as much because you can't afford to give millions of dollars to build airports and ports in other places, insofar as you have to spend more money just doing debt financing that is denominated in USD, and so all impacts on foreign policy on top half are downstream of this impact. Crucially there, 80% of the CCP's debt is denominated in US dollars, and the vast majority of it, even the private businesses operating in China, also have significant amounts of debt denominated in US dollars. You should know this because this is OIB, but the structural reason is because the US dollar is the global reserve currency, and the United States is the largest and most liquid financial markets in the world, and therefore most of the world's debt, not just China, but like everyone's debt, is more or less denominated in US dollars. So, how does Trump crucially make this problem better? Yeah, but worse? No. Harris makes it better. Harris makes it better. Trump makes it worse. Yeah. The crucial reason why is because the US dollar is far stronger under Trump and it costs more relative to the renminbi. The reason why is because, therefore, debt denominated in US dollars is far more expensive when the US dollar gets stronger. The crucial asymmetry in this debate lies in fiscal policy and the willingness of both these administrations to do government spending. What does the comparative look like? Under a Harris administration, the Democrats have already committed to significant amounts of government spending. The reason why is because voters support them crucially on a mandate of public services, things like welfare spending and healthcare spending, massive infrastructure bills like you empirically saw during the Biden era, climate change, which they've already committed to, which will require billions of dollars of investment and handouts and subsidies in order to get your burgeoning and clean energy market off of the ground. And note, this specifically is a context in which Harris needs to win over crucial swing voters who they need to basically win over and make like them by basically spending lots of money in their state. And notably, Harris also has to win over the other people within her own party because she didn't have to win a primary. And so the Democratic Party, not everyone is super enthusiastic about her. And so she basically has to curry favor by committing to lots of government spending. Versus the Republicans and Trump, who, you should know this, right? They've literally already promised to do things like reduce fiscal deficit. That is just like the sine qua non of a Republican administration. Things like slashing the role of government and making government smaller. This is the party we want to shrink government down to the size we can drag them to the bathroom and drown them in the sink. The GOP has been consistent on this through decades, which means, and this is why everyone was having a over government spending in Ukraine, right? We don't want to spend lots of billions of dollars and stuff in Ukraine. By the way, we want to reduce the fiscal deficit. So, under a Democratic administration, inflation is likely to be higher, insofar as inflation is just when you have more money chasing fewer goods, and if you pump more government money into the economy, that is when the US, and you just print more money to go brew, that is when inflation happens and the US dollar gets less valuable. So, even if there is only a small difference on inflation, a small difference of hundreds of billions of dollars in debt financing is absolutely crucial.
Both Trump and his economic advisor said they want to weaken the dollar. Your own opening said Trump is unpredictable, which also weakens the dollar because investors fear the dollar will become weaker, and we think that the dollar strength is
Couple
more...
responses to this. First, your first reason is a complete assertion. Secondly, I think, it is. Secondly, I think also, Chris can respond to that. On weighing, we beat opening opposition for 4 reasons. Firstly, our impact is far more certain. Opening opposition relies on characterization that Trump is unpredictable and the CCP could get fucked over. We give you certain reasons as to why they will get fucked over based on the historical track record of what both parties empirically have done. Secondly, our impact at more scale. They prove that if you believe everything, that there are some economic harms in specific interlinked industries. We prove that more expensive debt financing affects everything in your economy and your ability, the CCP's ability to pay for anything. Thirdly, I think that our impacts are more unique. They say that you get fewer rare raw materials for EVs and stuff like that, or like US tech for defense. You could probably get some of that stuff from somewhere else, maybe not as much, but maybe the problem isn't as big as they want to say. Whereas US debt is unique, like 80% of your debt literally just is denominated in USD, you can't get out of that. Fourthly, our problem is more grave. They say a problem might occur in the future. We say that we fix the problem that already exists, that is the existential threat of the CCP right now, which is why we are time sensitive and actually address the problems as they stand. Very proud to pose.
Closing government agrees with closing opposition when they say that the CCP and China are riddled with problems. Yes, they are. They have a huge debt, a huge youth unemployment, a huge spending on welfare, and they're in deep shit. But there are two ways that every political party can fix this. This is either you go and fix it, or you portray to your people as there is another problem that you have to fix, such as you have to counter USA in a rhetoric battle against Trump. And this is our path to victory. We're going to prove to you how Trump's rhetoric on its own, even if Trump does nothing, is enough for the CCP to smokescreen the problems happening in China, thus form the unrest within China, thus remain a legitimate party within China and cause stability. So what is our case here, and how does our case lead to closing opposition directly, and how does it weigh over all? Firstly, on opening government. Opening government has a high burden to prove. They have to prove that, they have a fine line to tread. The tread is that Trump usually does say isolationist things. He does say things such as we're going to go to trade war with China, and he goes to a trade war with China. He doesn't say things such as we are not going to do deal, we are going to withdraw out of NATO. But notice closing opposition is probably correct to point out that the economic harm of this is so big that it's probably the only thing that Trump does is says he's going to do those things. Opening government took a big burden to prove that Trump is going to upset basically the entirety of the global economy, even though opening opposition proves that this is also hurtful to this is also harmful to America insofar America and China are intertwined. Then our case comes in, because what Žnidar tells you is that it is enough for Trump to say those things and for CCP then to react to those things, for countries to not only not align themselves with the USA, but also for CCP to portray to their people like the main issue you have is to fight America, to counter USA, and then what CCP does is they don't necessarily go and invest more in FBI and aid. What CCP does is they hold summits that their newspapers talk about. They go to politicians which like USA doesn't like, such as Iran or Russia. What they do is they host meetings where USA is not invited. What they do is they bomb little ships in the South China Sea. What they do is they threaten they're going to attack Taiwan and hold military exercises. And this is what the news are writing about. The news are writing about the alleged USA threat, and the news are writing about how USA is countering that. This is our case. We are proving to you that insofar Trump's rhetoric exists, it strengthens the CCP insofar the CCP is able to paint a narrative in which USA is a problem, and they can deal with the problem by holding summits, by trashing USA, and by trashing little ships in the South China Sea. But the second thing is, not only does this smokescreen the internal issues, there are structural reasons and structural ways in which China does this. First is the narrative of a century of humiliation, where China says we were humiliated for so long that you have to prioritize doing justice in the global scale, that you have to prioritize putting us first. The way in which we are doing that is we have a lot of presidents coming into our country. Look, we're good friends with everyone. Look, we are holding summits and excluding USA from those summits. Second thing is, insofar China does this power projection and USA is isolationist in this way, this means that countries within the South China Sea see that the USA isn't doing anything. Insofar USA withdraws from Russia, from Ukraine, insofar USA says they're going to withdraw from NATO, even if they don't do it, for the countries within the South China Sea, it is quite risky when Taiwan is there to actually go and align themselves with the USA if USA is going to leave them to dry. And I think Petar raised this nicely, because what Petar tells you is that South America, I'm unsure how important this is. But South China Sea is probably the most crucial place to be. Why? Because it holds a strait that controls 1/3 of the GDP. Secondly, because all those countries are so crucially important for the defense of Taiwan. Insofar, those countries align themselves with the CCP. CCP can portray that to their people as, look, we are one step closer to Taiwan. Look, we are one step closer towards humiliating the nations that have humiliated us. In that situation, where the news who are controlled by the CCP only talk about that, what happens is that people forget about the debt. People forget about not getting products that CEO so hardly wants them to get. People see that their country is improving. Insofar, they're hosting literally like their symbolic things within their country and countering also dangerous USA. But secondly, now let's talk about the point about predictability and how we take out opening opposition. The first reason as to why Trump is we are going to prove that firstly, even though Trump does unpredictable things on Twitter, in his policy he's not that unpredictable. Firstly, because note what they say in their analysis. In their analysis, they say that America and China are so closely intertwined, which means that everything that you do to China also hurts you. And note the swing voters within countries who are probably going to lose their jobs if Trump does something drastic. So firstly, I'm unsure as to why Trump would do something so damaging and so drastic. Secondly, note that China is no longer that much dependent on the USA. The USA cannot do something that drastic. Firstly, because China is currently spreading the Wuhan, and meaning that it is less and less dependent on the United States of America. But secondly, China sanction-proof their economy. This means that China prepared for situations in which the USA is going to retaliate against them. Thus, China is no longer that dependent on the USA. Before going on, Marta, I'll take the European wide this time.
Trump has a massive stranglehold in the Republican Party, and Harris is a comparatively more reasonable, predictable candidate, which you should engage with, even though Aidan chose to knife on both, and you're held up to knifing your own opening.
No, this is not true. Trump is actively going against the entirety of the establishment within the Republican Party. He doesn't have that much of a strong hold within the Republican Party. But now let's talk about why, even if this isn't true, and the USA tariffs China and does this, why this doesn't harm China. Firstly, China has other markets. First, you have the European countries outside the EU. Second, you have Southeast Asia. And also note the rebuttal here, because they say, oh, but EU does whatever America tells them to do. Yeah, currently, but when Trump, that wants to literally defund the EU, that wants to withdraw from NATO comes, we are unsure as to why the EU would follow them and continue implementing EV tariffs. But secondly, note that this is also probably short-term, especially for the EU, which is a huge market. Why? Because there is a huge initiative for the EU to go green. But EU has two structural issues. Firstly, EU cannot meet the demand they have within the European Union. But secondly, the prices within the European Union are so high that even if you want to meet the demand, people cannot pay for those prices. Meaning that insofar they're adamant at pushing their policy for 2030 no longer producing gas or like oil cars, what they have to do is allow China to like import their cheap EVs. Which means that even if they do prove that tariffs are happening, they're probably symbolic and are happening like on both sides of the house in the short term. But note why our extension beats are opening. Firstly, because I already told you it is a lower burden to prove. They have to prove basically the upset of the entire global economy and all countries aligning with China rather than USA, which you saw didn't really happen during the last Trump mandate. But secondly, also because this is quite simple. You give CCP material to smokescreen the problems within China. CCP does that. People in China are a bit calmer, and CCP doesn't take that much shit from the people within China. This is a quite simplistic, intuitive case for you. For all those reasons, closing argument.
Ready? Politics isn't about specific people. It's about issues and pressures. Specific politicians are replaceable, but the forces that put them in place remain. This is not a debate about Trump, but a debate about Trumpism and the effect that Trumpism has had on the US political scene on both sides in this debate. What we give to you in extension is quite simple, which is a case about debt, which gets absolutely no challenge from closing opposition. We tell you that the dollar is going to be far, far stronger under Trump, and we bring to you two very important impacts that have the most direct effect on China in this debate. Firstly, what Aidan proves to you is that lenders will now call on their due and on their debts when China is at its weakest. That is, when you're in the middle of a financial crisis, that is when you want the dollar to go down because you don't have the money to pay these debt backs. This debt back. That's how you get liquidity shocks. That's how you're unable to fulfill the government deficit or to provide the services that matter the most to your people within the country. It's one of the biggest kicks in the balls that China can take, and this is the most certain impact because we don't rely on speculative future predictions, but rather the situation in China right now. Second impact, though, is that it makes the US far less of an attractive trading partner to other countries, and notice directly flips opening government. That is, when the dollar is weaker, you are far less likely to want to take on US debt to begin with. That is when countries become skeptical whether dollarization is correct for them. That is when associations like BRICS, countries like Brazil or India, turn to China for leadership when they see the Chinese yuan as being a more stable currency or better for them. I think that this is the most proximate way in which you can get those leaders to shift to you in the debate. I want to then immediately weigh your case versus the trade impacts coming out of the rest of the debate. There are three pieces of weighing here. Firstly, trade is rather static and depends on private market forces. It depends on the needs of individuals within the market itself, and it often isn't the case that the US government can control it too much. That being said, though, the government directly controls its deficit to a far larger extent. Secondly, though, where the US parties differ from each other most is in their internal economic policy. Yes, they might differ slightly on whether they've branded a trade war or some additional customs, but I think that questions like how much infrastructure do you build, how much do you tax people in your country, and which people do you tax in the first place, will be where President Trump and President Harris will differ the most in this debate. Third weighing, though, is that debt is the strongest form of control in this debate. That is, Chinese independence is currently being defaced by the decisions of the US Federal Reserve, and China gets far more political control over its partners when they're holding debt in the Chinese currency, exactly because you can exert the same pressures that are being exerted on China right now. The issue with both top half teams then is that they misunderstand Trumpism. The average Trump voter does not think on wide policy implications. He thinks on emotion, on the propaganda he consumes, and on the way in which his life is directly affected. Three things to say here as to why this is. Firstly, we're talking about the politically disillusioned and uneducated class within this debate. They voted Trump not because they understand the trade register and the deficit, but because of the effects of the political swamp on their lives in the first place. Second reason for this, though, is that it feels fucking amazing for them to have someone who speaks to them, who tells them you're the greatest nation on earth. It's a mentality and a way of life. It's not based on policy outcomes, it's based on how you feel. Thirdly, though, and importantly, it allows Trump to pursue his pro-business agenda. Both Trump and the Republican Party are beholden to large business donors who want to see lower taxes. They want to see more deregulation. These are things which you're able to squeeze past at the point at which you're no longer going to be projecting these things to the American public. The implication of this argument is simple. Trump is only pressured by his voters to pass policy when it changes how much gas costs, when the price at the supermarket change, or when it makes them feel good to be American. The problem with both top half teams, either on the idea of embargo in Europe or Latin America, or the idea of whether you're going to start a trade war in China, is that they never prove to you why the American voter cares whether Trump follows through with this. Yes, he promises these things, but all top half does is they point out why he will promise them. They never show you why he will do them. That means then that the cases don't connect within this debate. Note then how this works on each of the teams. Firstly, the all trade case is out. Insofar, I don't think Trump is likely to implement the trade war. The issue is that they never justify why they'll see it through, and I think opening government is right to show why this doesn't happen. Beyond this, though, the real harms of the trade war probably mean that he's not very likely to implement it. That is, he's going to take the proverbial wins, he's going to make small pushes that are enough for him to be able to get a win on the media, but I don't think he's ever going to do it fully. The reason for this is exactly because opening government is right, and the economic harms are going to be very, very high on both sides of the house. Secondly, though, this deals with the OG assertion that Trump will act to significantly harm either Europe or Latin America. Yes, he's going to piss off some leaders, but check your notes. All they say is that Trump is abrasive. The thing is, though, these are some of your important economic partners. Your donors are the people who rely on these imports, these raw materials, these resources. I don't think you're going to do this to a very large extent. Thirdly, though, Trump is going to be very, very hesitant to essentially damage the US economy to this extent. Given that the way he has been blaming Biden has been about the management of the economy, I think this is one of the primary reasons that he wants to make sure the economy remains healthy. At this point then, you should be convinced that trade doesn't change. What changes is internal policy, and what internal policy changes most is debt. That means then that our trade case connects, closing, yeah.
Even if you are right, this only applies insofar as OG's case. You have to also deal with CG's case that the threat of protectionism pushes businesses out of countries like Vietnam and pushes them closer to Chinese influence, which is in the interest of China.
Yeah, look, it's the case that like businesses are likely to not be affected insofar as regulations and businesses are the same on both sides. That is, given that protectionism is roughly symmetric in this debate for the reasons we give, you're being outframed by our case as well there. Finally then, I want to respond to what is left from opening government. The first thing they give is this idea that Trump is likely to essentially, push through these policies because his voters are likely to want these things. The issue though is that I proved to you that the voters care more about the immediate effects. What they say is you get more jobs. Check your notes, no mechanization in top half, as to why trade wars create more jobs. Trade wars lead to fewer jobs, insofar as what they do is that they make it far more difficult to get things like the raw resources, to get things like, the most different types of cheaper labor. But also the important piece of framing is that most of the US economy is made on more high-level types of manufacturing. It's things like batteries or the raw materials in China. You're perfectly able to do both things. Finally, on closing government. Look, the issue of their case is that I don't think the Chinese Communist Party needs to justify itself in terms of messaging. Yes, you are able to get some propaganda, but the issue is that this is not something which you couldn't get in RSI just by lying to your people, as you often do. What really matters, though, is our case on the backlash you're going to get when you crash the Chinese economy. When you get billions, if not trillions, of dollars of debt being called in, this is when your people backlash against you the most. Our path to victory is simple. We show that trade doesn't change, but we show how it is that the monetary situation, how fiscal policy changes, and how this is the most proximate thing that concerns China. I'm very proud to oppose this right now.